Welcome to the Macmillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Leslie Harkema, an assistant professor of Spanish at Yale University. Her research focuses on 19th and 20th century Peninsular literature, with a particular interest in how post-Enlightenment literature in Spain responds to political, religious, and scientific discourses within modernity. Today we'll talk with Professor Harkema about her current book project, which is a study of the relationship between the prolific essayist and poet Miguel de Unamuno and a group of writers known in the 1920s as the Young Literature. Welcome, Professor Harkema.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, tell us about Miguel de Unamuno. Who is he?
Well, Unamuno was one of the central intellectual figures in early 20th century Spain, the period leading up to the Spanish Civil War. He actually died while under house arrest at the very beginning of the Civil War, and he was under house arrest. He was there due to the Francoist forces who were keeping him under house arrest. He was born in the 19th century in the Basque Country and actually spent most of his adult life in Salamanca, which is closer to the center of Spain, in Madrid. And he was a professor of Greek, actually, at the university there, and became the rector of the University of Salamanca. So, pretty high-profile figure. He's most well-known today for his novels, which are read fairly widely throughout the world, as well as for his philosophical work, kind of in the existentialist tradition. He was very influenced by Søren Kierkegaard, for example. There's an anecdote that he taught himself Danish in order to read Kierkegaard in the original. But he was also a poet, a dramatist, obviously a pedagogue, a teacher, and also a frequent commentator on all kinds of social issues in Spain in this period. I'm particularly interested in him as a public intellectual, as an essayist, and also as a poet.
Okay. So what is it about him that led you to study him? What speaks to you?
It's interesting. He's one of the Spanish authors that everyone reads when they're studying Hispanic literature, but I first got into Unamuno when I was translating some of his early poetry into English while still working on my doctoral degree. And when you translate literary texts, especially poetry, you have to reach a sort of intimacy with the author of the original work. And I became fascinated with Unamuno's poetics, his relationship to poetry, which is something I hadn't heard much about, but which I've come to recognize as fundamental for his thinking about art and really across the board in his work. This led me to realize that he actually has a poetic legacy in Spanish literature in this period, the early 20th century, which hadn't really been studied, or it might be better to say it was forgotten by scholars. And this led me to thinking about his impact on writers who grew up reading him in the 1910s and 1920s, and especially this issue that I talk about in my book of youth and the rise of youth culture in the early 20th century in Spain.
Okay, so let's talk about your book project. Tell us about it.
Sure. The title of the book in progress is Spanish Modernism and the Aesthetics of Youth. And in it I analyze the way kind of a broad obsession or fascination with youth in early 20th century Europe affected Spanish literature during what's known in Spanish cultural history as the Silver Age, La Edad de Plata, which dates from the turn of the century to about, again, the Civil War. And during this whole period in Europe, youth is really ubiquitous. If we're thinking of the founding of the Boy Scouts in 1906, or the premiere of J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan, the play, or James Joyce's novel, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, youth is all over the place. Also in war propaganda during World War I, or even later in the fascist movements of the 1920s and 30s. I argue in my book that youth had a special metaphorical significance for Spain during this period because For many years, even centuries before this, Spain had been seen as somehow immature or underdeveloped as a nation. The idea was that it was modernizing more slowly than other countries such as Germany, England, or France primarily. Of course, this wasn't really the case. A lot of recent scholarship has shown that modernity came unevenly to all of these countries, and in some ways Spain was really on the cutting edge of whatever we mean by modernity, right? But it was certainly perceived that way by many intellectuals in Europe and especially within Spain as well.
That's interesting.
Two of Unamuno's contemporaries, Joaquin Costa and the philosopher José Ortega y Gasset, both, while they talk a lot about youth, they argue that Spain in some way is too immature and that it needs to grow up as a nation, be more mature, more adult.
Okay, so let's talk about the young literature and its relationship to Unamuno.
Sure. My argument in the book is that Unamuno really embraces this idea of Spain as immature or young relative to other parts of Europe.
But why do you think that is?
It's through the way that he talks about youth in general. It's all over the place in his work. He celebrates it. He uses it as a metaphor for talking about religious faith, one aspect of Spanish culture that sometimes is seen as holding Spain back in terms of the Enlightenment. And he talks about it in the context of politics. He sees new political movements, especially socialism in Spain at the time, as young movements, and also in poetics itself. So he's always, for him, youth is always the term he's going to hold up as positive against an old civilization.
Okay.
So with these younger writers, who were younger than he was, this group called La Joven Literatura, the young literature, that forms in the 1920s, what happens is all of these writers were reading Unamuno, especially at the age when they were adolescents.
Wow.
And they were inspired by what he wrote, and also by the interaction they had with him in person. So they didn't just read him, they also met him at places like the Residencia de Estudiantes, which was the center in Spain where Federico Garcia Lorca lived, along with Salvador Dali and Luis Buñuel. A few years ago, there was a movie made called Little Ashes that talks about the time that these artists spent there. In any case, the Residencia de Estudiantes was a meeting point for all of these younger artists, and Unamuno also spent a great deal of time there as well, giving lectures, talking with these younger writers. He wrote to many of them, had extended correspondence with them, and all of them, whether they had a close relationship with Unamuno or not, and I study some of those who were closest to him in my book, all of them recognized him as a kind of poetic predecessor and a maestro. So they were publishing his poems in their own journals, they were including him in their anthologies. So it's interesting that these writers who are often not associated with Unamuno, who's older than them, actually looked to him quite a bit and had a great deal of intimacy with him surrounding this idea of youth as central to poetic creation and artistic creation.
And did that continue as he grew older and also the young literature group grew older?
That's a great question. Actually, well, in some ways, when the young literature was forming, he was already an old man, which makes it hard to...
What do you mean by old man?
Absolutely. Another good question. He was in his 60s at this time, which certainly wouldn't be considered old necessarily today, but in the Spain of that period,
but certainly not young. And then how old were the young writers?
They were in their 20s and 30s.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and as I said, they were started to read him probably in their teens already. So when they're aging, that's a great question. What happens in Spain is that the Civil War hits. That puts an end to Unamuno's life, puts an end to some of the younger writers' lives like Federico Garcia Lorca. It's well known that he was killed by the nationalists at the beginning of the war.
So
as
Unamuno
well.
was killed.
Unamuno died under house arrest.
Okay.
Lorca, who's maybe the best known poet outside of Spain today, was killed roughly just a few months before Unamuno died by the nationalists. So the war puts an end to youth in Spain in some ways, and those who survive are either they either remain in Spain, some of them become fascist and work within the government actually, some are exiled. But in my book I argue that all of them take this idea of youth from Unamuno and use it in different ways. So it's fascinating to see in the late 20s and early 30s, for example, you have young writers who are both of communist leanings and fascist leanings who are citing Unamuno's early work to justify their visions for a rejuvenation of Spanish culture.
Okay. Very interesting. So how did Unamuno's concept of youth shape Spain's Silver Age?
Well, I would say, again, it really reaches very wide in the period, but I think Unamuno, more than any of his contemporaries, really, those of his same generation, if you will, strove to invert the hierarchy between, or the hierarchical relationship between adulthood and youth. As I said before, youth for him was always conceptually preferable to age. And his vindication of youth and young people inspired many writers to run with their own ideas, let's say. So his impact, in a way, anticipates the importance of youth culture throughout the 20th century, because what he was doing was encouraging young people, in a sense, to use the term from the 1960s, to question authority, right? And that's what made his work interesting to young people in Spain in the early 20th century. And I think it's also what makes him interesting to readers today and to my students who read him in college classrooms.
And basically, I guess, readers today, is there a certain universal appeal to his writing?
I think so. I think in that sense especially. His writing is so playful, and again, this is seen in some of his best-known novels. People often read his novel Niebla, Mist, which really is very playful, and in which he actually makes himself into a character in the novel and has a debate with one of the characters over who is the real author of the story, who really has control over the story. This kind of play with authority in the text, I think, is very interesting, and it's something that worked throughout the various genres in which he wrote, so his poetry as well. I do think that is the timeless appeal of Unamuno's work, and the reason why so many young people are attracted to it.
Right, right. Well, very interesting. Thank you so much for being here with us today and sharing some of your work.
Thanks again for having me.
For more information about Professor Harkema, please visit our website at yale.edu/Macmillan Report. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the Macmillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.